everybody. My presentation today will be about a special kind of fiction, more exactly about sensation fiction. We will be talking about sensation fiction as form of fiction and about a writer whose name is William Wilkie Collins and about his most important novel, The Woman in White. So let's try to move on to the first part, form of fiction. Sensation literature does not belong to the Victorian canon. It is a kind of side literature, as many critics consider. But on the other hand, there are also critics who consider that sensation fiction may very well belong to the canon. So let's try to see what is Victorian sensation fiction. First of all, we talk about a novel with a secret. So there is a secret which is hidden between the pages of the novel, and the whole development of this novel will be to find out what this secret actually is. These kinds of novels, these kinds of writings, combine romance and realism in a way that practically both of these characteristics are quite exaggerated sometimes. They try to be very, very romantic and very, very realist at the same time. So let us not forget that the theme of such novels is a guilty secret, and usually what we read, what we are told about, is something improbable and at the same time melodramatic and lurid. Now, we have been talking about melodrama, more exactly in the context of Charles Dickens. And we spoke about melodrama as a kind of suspenseful form of fiction. So that is a kind of fiction that cultivates this suspense. What the sensation fiction brought to the forescene is the fact that this melodrama, this unexpected aspects of real life, are associated with everybody's home. So they are associated with very, very common places. We have a kind of everyday Gothic, but everyday Gothic is not the everyday Gothic that you probably know from the Castle of Otranto. It is a kind of Gothic minus the supernatural, aristocratic accessories. Now, what brought about the flourishing of this kind of fiction is middle-class nougat, and this nougat type of novels are associated with spectacular crime, are associated with the lives of criminals. Newgate was a prison, so it was associated with a series of stories that told the public about the life of the convicts in Newgate prison. So, what does this characteristic of sensation refer to? So first of all, we have fears, we have anxieties. The characters fear something. The characters are in a way obsessed by certain things which may, in very many cases, appear quite common in Victorian cultural institutions. So practically, the sensation fiction was a reaction against the middle class stiffness, against the middle class pudibondery and prudery. So the fact that the middle class did not accept these things as being normal. So what does this kind of fiction bring about? Unrealistic elements. Now, these are characteristics which are very often associated with common Victorian critics. So we talk about unrealistic elements. This kind of fiction may be considered brash, vulgar, and subversive. And if you look at the quotation, you see that it's preaching to the nerve instead of the judgment. And the Punch in 1863 wrote about the fact that it's massive objects, quote, harrying the mind, making the flesh creep, causing the hair to stand on end, giving shocks to the nervous system, destroying conventional moralities, and generally unfitting the public for the prosaic avocations of life. You have to admit that this is very, very direct and very harsh characterization. This sensation fiction was very, very popular. It was very popular because it was a product of mass culture. To a certain extent, this kind of fiction is also associated with the novel. So, in a way, it complied with the market law of demand and supply. So, the idea is that very many people demanded such kinds of writings, wanted such kind of writings. They wanted them to read them. So, in a way, it's this kind of sensation fiction is direct source of popular fiction that is associated with the so-called penny press, and usually it's cheap and quite inexpensive publications that are associated with the interests, with the cultural interests of the lower and working classes. So this kind of fiction is very closely associated with the so-called penny dreadfuls or shilling shockers that were kind of brochures, that were kind of pamphlets in which this type of literature was very, very common. And they were called penny dreadfuls and shilling shockers because they were, of course, not expensive. The idea is to have them sold easily. So practically, we can talk about the fact that by complying with the demand of the reading public, this kind of sensation fiction gave us the first popular bestsellers of the Victorian age. Why was this kind of fiction so popular? And if we have a look at the entries in the slide, we see that very much is also associated with the popularity of the novel. So first of all, the abolition of the stamp duty on printing paper in 1855. Practically paper was no longer so expensive. The concomitant increase in the circulation of newspapers. And this was, of course, due to the fact that newspapers were not very difficult to print. Newspapers were very easy to publish. An increase in numbers of readers in mid-Victorian Britain. And please don't forget the fact that people were schooled, people could read, people could write. And what is very important is also the fact that they had time. And then we have the so-called circulating libraries. You probably remember them from the Victorian novel. So this kind of sensation fiction was also associated with circulating libraries because circulating libraries also had these kinds of publications. And then there are the so-called new weekly and monthly literary magazines, and this time they were also illustrated because the development of science and industry allowed the introduction of illustrations. And then, of course, there is the so-called serialized fiction, high interest, in order to keep the interest of the public awake. And then we have an expanding bookmarking and growth of the reading public. All of them due to the development in society. And then, of course, very special to the sensation fiction is the existence of notorious trials. So there is the case of the poisoner Palmer in 1885, 1850, 1855, 1856. And he offered the subject of very much such literature. And then we have the so-called tabloid journalism, so-called penny journalism. We do have tabloid journalism today as well. So dealing with with what the public usually wants to read. And then reforms in divorce procedures. People were very interested not only in marriages, but also in divorces. So very many newspapers also told stories about how people divorced. And this was, of course, very interesting for the public. So let's see what existed before this kind of sensation fiction. So first of all, we have the so-called melodramatic novels. And the melodramatic novels are the novels associated with writers, and you probably remember the name by now, Charles Dickens. He was not the only writer to write melodramatic novels. And then the so-called Newgate novels. I told you that Newgate was a prison. So these novels were stories or tales that told about criminals. And then there is the existence of so-called romantic and gothic genres of fiction. Romantic associated with love, in many cases associated with destructive love, and with gothic genres of fiction with mystery. And then there is the so-called Gothic influence. So this Gothic influence is also associated with the guilty secret. And please don't forget that at the center of this kind of literature is the existence of a guilty secret. And then we no longer speak about Gothic ghost stories. They no longer exist. Don't forget, we are in an age of realism. But practically, the terror, the very frightful expectations is this time very real, and it is also very believable. Now, a very interesting aspect which I'd like you to pay attention to is a collection of ingredients. And when later on we talk about Wilkie Collins, the woman in white, I'd like you to refer to these ingredients and see how many of them he uses in his novels. So let's read together: adultery, theft, kidnapping, insanity, forgery, arson, blackmail, madness, persecuted innocence, and heroes placed in physical danger. And then bigamous marriages, romantic triangles, misdirected letters, seduction and murder, drug potions, poisons, disguises, manipulated coincidences, aristocratic villains, heightened suspense, and detailism. So you are given very many details to be as real as possible to show you that very many things that you read about are factual. So whenever you wanted to write a sensation novel, you just borrowed one or two or three or four of such ingredients. Just like when you want to bake a good pizza today, you take, like, for instance, cheese and tomatoes and salami and eggs and whatnot. In the case of sensation fiction, here you have a list of ingredients. Now, first of all, um, the characteristics of sensation fiction is a so-called domestication of crime. So crime and secrets and illicit sexuality are associated with real life, are associated with normal homes. So practically, where do all these unusual elements happen? It is in middle-class homes and families. So everybody might turn into a criminal. Your neighbor, the governess. So everybody could become a criminal and do some mischief against you. So practically, the Victorian home is criminalized and thus defamiliarized. So in a way, criminality is associated with the Victorian home and defamiliarized because it is no longer the Victorian home that we're used to. And please don't forget that very much of the public is interested in unusual aspects, in unusual elements that don't go with the ordinary. Reality is in this way reconstructed based on several sources and daily newspapers, don't forget about them, and about actual crimes and abuses. And then we have reports about crimes and courtroom reports that were very, very frequently found in Victorian press of the 1850s and 1860s. Charles Dickens used to read this kind of reports in the newspapers, and for him, these aspects became very, very um, popular and interesting, and he used them considerably in his novels. Now, usually this realism is governed by setting, very special setting, usually during the night, during a storm, and this realism is also associated with characters because the evil elements of the novel are, of course, the characters that have to be evil, of course. And then we have sensational plots. So practically the result is that we have a novel of incident or a plotting novel. Now, the sensational characters were quite mechanical. So practically, they were like little puppets. They were like robots, robocops, but that were used to hang on unexpected events, to depend on such unexpected events. So sensational meant accidental. So something which happened because of accident. It is not any rule of the logic that make these things happen. And then very important is the existence of coincidence rather than consequence. Consequence is logical. Coincidence is not logical. And of course, by being not logical, coincidence is also better expected, better received. Now, suspense, which is also common in other novels, is very much increased. And then we have several climaxes, we have the sensation scenes. So practically it is like traveling from one mountain to the other one, from one climax to the other one. And then what became very important is less the narrative voice. So less the way such stories were told, but plot. So the plot is something which also overrides the narrator. So the sensation narrator is not a very special authority. He is not an omniscient writer because there are things he has to withhold from the readers. He cannot tell everything to the readers from the very beginning. So having these characteristics in mind, we can say that such narrators are no longer omniscient. Sometimes the narrators do belong to the story. They belong to the crimes, and then sometimes they may be the criminals themselves. They do have a criminal interest. And of course, this also explains why we're not told all of these details by such people, by such narrators. Now here you have a list. There are very many such novels. But the most important ones are The Woman in White by William Wilkie Collins. We'll be talking about Wilkie Collins in a moment. And then we have Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And then Mrs. Henry Wood or Ellen Price or Ellen Wood wrote East Lynne in 1861. And then Mary Braddon or Mary Elizabeth Braddon or M.E. Braddon, so she used different names, wrote Lady Audley's Secret. And a very interesting series because we do have 6 titles, is The Chronicles of Carlingford by Mrs. Oliphant. Well, our interest, as I told you, will be the woman in white and great expectations. So let's try to move on to the first part. So now, this being said, let's try to move on to our writer of today. His name is William Wilkie Collins, and he is very much associated with the novel The Woman in White. So this is the picture of this writer, and he was a very, very prolific one. So here we have a whole list, of course not comprehensive, of his writings, The Woman in White. And then if you go a little bit down the list, you find The Moonstone. So practically it is these novels are the first 4 ones that are the most important ones. And the most important of the most important ones is, of course, The Woman in White. But we can continue the titles. And here we have some more. I told you that this man was a very, very prolific writer. Now, William Wilkie Collins is practically the master of sensation fiction. William Wilkie Collins is the master who taught Charles Dickens, because they were very, very good friends. So he taught Charles Dickens to write this kind of melodramatic literature, this kind of sensation literature that attracted the public. So the result was that William Wilkie Collins published quite a lot in Charles Dickens's magazine All the Year Round. So All the Year Round was made famous by William Wilkie Collins. It was quite dull when Charles Dickens went on publishing his novels. So there had to be William Wilkie Collins there, master of the form, creator of suspense. He's absolutely a perfect creator of suspense. He knows how to keep the audience waiting. He's the master of cliffhangers. And what I want you to remember is this very, very simple definition of this kind of sensation fiction. So practically, what brought success to this sensation fiction? Make them laugh, make them cry, make them wait. So these are the most important aspects that have to be used, have to be taken into consideration by a writer who decided to write a sensation novel, sensation story. To do that, the most important of his novels is The Woman in White, that was published serially in All the Year Round, and I told you, and then later on it was published in book form. And here you have a picture of the first edition of The Woman in White. And it is considered to be one of the best constructed, one of the finest of the sensation novels. It is considered Collins's best novel, best creation. And then believe me that during his lifetime, The Woman in White was very, very popular. So practically, of all the list of the novels, he's remembered because of The Woman in White. So that is why on the grave of William Wilkie Collins, which is in Kensal Green Cemetery in London, there is an inscription. So here we have the details. And then you are told there that Wilkie Collins was the author of The Woman in White and other works of fiction. So practically what counted was The Woman in White. I told you that The Woman in White was a very famous story, and practically it can be summed up in just one sentence. It is the story of what a woman's patience can endure and what a man's resolution can achieve. And it was extremely successful commercially. So there were people who were buying clothes called Woman in White. There was also perfumes, Woman in White. People queued up at the entrance of shops not only to buy the books It was not yet the time of Harry Potter. It was the time of the woman in white. But of course, very many commercial things, commercial objects were associated with a woman in white. As you may imagine, the critics, the contemporary critics, who were also Victorian, were generally hostile, were very much against this kind of fiction. Now, the novel contains quite a lot of characters, but the most important ones you have now. Here is my list. It's Walter Hartwright, Laura Fairley, Frederick Fairley, Marian Halcombe, and Catherine. She is the woman in white. Jane Catherine, her mother. Sir Percival Glyde, who's a baronet, and her husband to be. Count Fosco, Sir Percival Glyde's best friend, and Countess Fosco, Madame Fosco, as she's called in the novel, Count Fosco's um, uh, wife. So the most important characters are Walter Hartwright, Laura Fairley, and Marian Halcombe. This is the disposition of characters. So practically we have them arranged in two groups. On the left hand, you have the women. Laura Fairley and Catherine. I told you that she is the woman in white. And Laura Fairley and Anne Catherine are so very similar that you can mistake one for the other. And then there is the Marian Halcombe, a very masculine character, a very important character in order to solve the mystery of the novel. On the right-hand side are the mischief makers, the villains, the rascals, Sir Percival Glyde, and then Count Fosco, who is Italian, and his wife, Madame Fosco. Madame Fosco, who's the carrier, the harbinger of everything in order to help Sir Percival Glyde and Count Fosco dominate and oppress Laura Fairley and Anne Catherine. And then we have Walter Hartwright, who appears in the middle. So Walter Hartwright is the young man who oscillates between the two groups in order to fulfill the. So here we have a triangle. Walter Hartwright is in love with Laura Fairley. Laura Fairley is very much associated with her best friend Marian Halcombe, and Walter Cartwright also needs Marian Halcombe in order to discover the secrets of this novel, of the existence of the characters in this novel, the secrets of the woman in white. Now, the narrative technique is a very interesting element. I told you that in many sensation novels, the narrative technique is not the first important, is not on the first place. So here, the narrative technique is very important because we have a series of first-person narrators. So we have a collection of narrators. So practically each narrator narrates the part of the story where he is present. He narrates the story according to his own personality. He interprets the novel as he or she wants. And then Hartwright is a kind of editor. So practically, of course, he lives within the story, and there will be parts of the story that he will tell himself. But he will also collect these narratives, and then he will edit them, and then he will arrange them, and practically he is not allowed, and he will never intervene in the narrative of these people. So we have a lot of text, and very many of them were self-consciously written. So at the beginning of the novel, we have a very interesting confession in which we are told about the existence of this editor and existence of this young man whose main job is to record the narratives of these people involved and practically arrange them. No circumstance of importance from the beginning to the end of the discourse shall be related on hearsay evidence. When the writer of these introductory lines, Walter Hartwright by name, happens to be more closely connected than others with the incidents to be recorded, he will describe them in his own person. Was his experience fails, he will retire from the position of narrator, and his task will be continued from the point at which he has left it off by other person who can speak to the circumstances under notice from their own knowledge, just as clearly and positively as he has spoken before them. So the novel begins with a statement of fact, a kind of introduction in which we are told how the story will be narrated, so that we do not expect people telling lies, but people telling most important aspects of the story. So, what is the story about? Basically, it is the struggle for power, and very much of this is associated with who controls texts, because by signing legal documents um, incorrectly and by writing in illegal spaces such documents, and then Anne Catherine composes letters, and then she composes letters in which she confesses certain aspects. And then Fosco violates the private diary of Marian Halcombe, and he completes it with certain words. So practically, the novel is based very much on a succession of texts told by everyone associated with the story, edited by William Hartwright, and at the same time, extremely important in the novel is the text itself. Who owns the text will own everything. So we continue. So it is not only text on paper, but also on the tombstone. So Walter Hartwright emphasizes the inscription on the tombstone, and we have Marian Halcombe who writes several letters. She tries to inform the other people of what is going on, but Madame Fosco will intercept these letters, and then the result of the story is that it will not happen as Marian Holcomb wanted it, because as I told you, these letters were stolen by Madame Fosco. The story happens up to a certain point as Madame Fosco. Now, I told you at the beginning of my presentation that very important is the constructor of the novel, and William Wilkie Collins is a master of suspense, a creator of unprecedented suspense. So I'm going to give you three examples. You probably know that very important in those days was when an installment finished, it had to be finished in such a way so that the people wanted to buy the new installment. So here I give you three situations. The first one is melodrama. The confession of her heart's secret burst from her in those pleading words. I had no right to hear them, no right to answer them. They were the words that banished me in the name of a sacred weakness from the room. It was all over. I dropped her hand. I said no more. The blinding tears shut her out from my eyes, and I dashed them away to look at her for the last time. One look as she sank into her chair, as her arms fell on the table, as as her fair head dropped on them wearily. One farewell look, and the door had closed upon her. The great gulf of separation had opened between us. The image of Laura Fairley was a memory in the past already. As I told you, it is melodrama, but of course, the idea is, will they see each other again? If you want to find out, by the next installment. Another type is the end of the 21st installment, and this is very much associated with adventure. The action takes place during the night. It is a stormy and rainy night, and Marian Halcombe tries to go along the wall and on the roof in order to overhear what Count Fosco and Sir Percival Glyde were talking about. As I crept to the wall and raised myself against it, I looked back and saw the window of the Count's dressing-room gleam into light. My sinking courage flickered up in me again, and kept my eyes fixed on his window as I stole my way back step by step past the wall of the house. The clock struck the quarter after 1. When I laid my hands on the window sill of my own room, I had seen nothing and heard nothing which could lead me to suppose that my retreat had been discovered. But her retreat was discovered, and we will very soon find out that because of the rain she would have a very nasty cold, and then this will be the possibility for Count Fosco to sneak into her room, to snatch her diary, and to introduce their certain notes. So if you want to find out what happened to Marian Halcombe, you have to buy the next installment. And then you have the end of the 26th installment. This is Gothic. But the veiled woman had possession of me, body and soul. Well, this happens in a graveyard. But the veiled woman had possession of me, body and soul. She stopped on one side of the grave. We stood face to face with the tombstone between us. She was close to the inscription on the side of the pedestal. Her gown touched the black letters. The voice came nearer and rose more passionately still. Hide your face, don't look at her. Oh, for God's sake, spare him, sorry. The woman lifted a veil, sacred to the memory of Laura Lady Glyde. Laura Lady Glyde was standing by the inscription and was looking at me over the grave. What's going on? What will happen in a moment? How come that he was sitting at Laura's grave, and then there was somebody who was looking at him, and that was Laura? Of course, we will soon find out that it was not Laura, it was Anne Catherine, but the two women resembled so closely that you could take one for the other. And now a very interesting thing, and practically this is something for us to discuss later on, is Collins's recipe to cook a sensation novel. And then if you read the novel very carefully, you will see that he uses quite a lot of these ingredients. We do have adultery, we do have theft, we don't have kidnapping, we have insanity, we have forgery, we don't have arson, we have quite a lot of blackmail, we do have madness, we have persecuted innocence, and as I told you, this is usually associated with women, and the woman in white is persecuted innocence. And then we have heroines placed in physical danger. In very many instances, the woman in white, Marian Holcomb, would be in such a situation. And then we have bigamous marriages. Practically, we don't have this situation here, but we do have romantic triangles. One of them you saw. We have misdirected letters which are sent by Marian Holcomb, but which are purloined. which are stolen by Madame Fosco. We have seduction, we have murder, we have less drugs, but we do have potions, less poisons, but potions. We have disguises. We have manipulated coincidences. We have villains, aristocratic villains. If a villain is more aristocratic, the shock. If you take into consideration what he really is and what he is supposed to show the reader. So here we have aristocratic villains, we have heightened suspense, and we have detailism, rigorous realism. There are certain passages with so many, so minute details that you could see that they were seen under the microscope. So with these, my presentation finishes. So with the image of Queen Victoria, I have to thank you for your attention. So let's try to move on to the first part.